All right, I want to thank everyone for coming today to the Lake Michigan Nuclear Issues Briefing that we are putting on for the benefit of the congressional staffs of the states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Illinois. My name is Dave Kraft. I'm Director of Nuclear Energy Information Service. We're based in Chicago, Illinois. We're a 40-year-old environmental safe energy group. And you'll be hearing today from various experts from around the Great Lakes who have been following nuclear issues. So the format for today is we'll have presentations by 5 of us. At the end of the presentations, we'll open it up for discussion, question and answer. And we invite you to put any questions you might have, or links, as I say, in the chat box. We'll refer to that when we get to the question and answer period as well. Again, thank you all for coming today. I'll just give a brief introduction and then turn it over to our first speaker. Those of you who are from congressional staffs, we really appreciate you being here. This is a presentation about issues of concern for Lake Michigan, and all of your offices are affected by this one way or another. I know here in Illinois we've been meeting for the last year and a half with members of the Senate staffs for Senators Durbin and Duckworth, and I know my colleagues that you'll hear from have been doing the same in their states. At the present time on Lake Michigan, we have 2 operating stations in Michigan, no operating stations in Illinois. The Zion reactors have been torn down, but up in Wisconsin, they also have 2 nuclear stations with 3 reactors in operation. So you'll be hearing some of the problems with those today. So our first speaker is a friend and colleague, Kevin Camps from Beyond Nuclear in Tacoma Park, Maryland. Kevin, go ahead.
Thanks, Dave. I'm gonna try to share my screen here. Try to get it in presentation mode. There we go. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor and a privilege to present on this panel. My name is Kevin Camps. I serve as radioactive waste specialist at Beyond Nuclear, which is based in Washington, D.C. And I've been on the board of directors of Don't Waste Michigan, which is the statewide anti-nuclear coalition in the Great Lakes state since 1993. So there are many nuclear concerns on the Great Lakes, every single stage of the uranium fuel chain. But today we are focused on the reactors, and specifically the reactors on Lake Michigan shorelines. So as Dave mentioned, there are 2 giant operating units at DC Cook in Southwest Michigan, another very risky reactor at Palisades, and then up north, the permanently shut down Big Rock Point nuclear power plant. So Palisades in Covert Township, Van Buren County, here's an image of it. Van Buren County is one of the most productive agricultural areas in the state of Michigan. Big Rock Point, up north, in between Petoskey and Charlevoix. This is a postcard from its operational phase. All of those facilities are since gone. They've been dismantled, but what is still there is lingering radioactive contamination of the site, including in Lake Michigan, as well as high-level radioactive waste storage. And Cook, also in Southwest Michigan, you'll note that there are no cooling towers at Cook, which is an issue at Point Beach. Tremendous thermal damage to Lake Michigan caused by Cook for almost a half century now. But my main focus today is going to be on the Palisades reactor. And my main points include over a year of very high-risk operations yet to come, the proposed takeover of the Palisades and Big Rock Point sites by the company Holtec International, and also the vulnerability to record high Lake Michigan water levels combined with extreme weather due to climate change. So about another year or more of reactor operations. There are several safety significant system structures and components at Palisades that are pathways to meltdown, and that's why even 14 more months of operations is very concerning. The main one I'll focus on is embrittled reactor pressure vessel. But you've also got a degraded lid, you've got degraded steam generators, you have perpetually flawed control rod drive mechanisms. These are all very important safety systems that are on the brink of failure at Palisades. I'll also touch on security breaches. and the need for a just transition. So this document was by a previous owner, Consumers Energy, presenting to the Michigan Public Service Commission in spring of 2006, justifying the sale to Entergy, seeking the Public Service Commission's permission to sell the plant. And you'll see that Consumers was arguing that Entergy would fix the reactor vessel head, would fix the steam generators, and would fix the reactor vessel that is embrittled, none of which have happened in all these years since. Despite the fact that degraded lid in Ohio was the nearest miss to a major accident since 3 Mile Island, despite the fact that steam generator flaws at San Onofre Units 2 and 3 in California led to the permanent shutdown of that plant in 2013. So Palisades is just pushing the safety risks. And we are at 50 plus years of age-related degradation now, as of last month. The control rod drive mechanism failures date back to initial operations in 1972, and none other than David Lochbaum, the former head of safety on nuclear power at Union of Concerned Scientists, refers to Palisades' fixes of its control rod drive mechanism failures as Band-Aid fixes, and those are still with us as we speak. So the risks of pressurized thermal shock, this is what can happen with an embrittled reactor pressure vessel. You can have a through-wall fracture. You can lose the coolant in the core. If the containment fails, as it happened in Japan, you could have a catastrophic release of hazardous radioactivity. So this was some street theater we did at Van Buren State Park around the year 2000, I believe. That's me speaking, and Michael Keegan's also in the photo. What we compared the emergency core cooling system at Palisades to was that hammer there. And what we compared the reactor pressure vessel to was that glass vessel. And the blue tarp is the lake. And we also had some milk jugs representing the dairies in the area, not only at Palisades, but near Cook in Southwest Michigan. So when your emergency core cooling system becomes a hammer, that's a real problem. What's going on is 2,000 pounds of pressure per square inch on the reactor pressure vessel. And if the emergency core cooling system activates, that's like a hot glass under cold water, and you can have a through-wall fracture. This is Arnie Gunderson of Fairwinds. He was our expert witness several years back on embrittlement at Palisades. And he put out a video, educational video called Nuclear Crackdown. And he also did an essay called Downstream, looking at what a Fukushima scale catastrophe on the Great Lakes shore would look like. And all of these references I'm going to cite with links in a 2-pager, so watch for that in the future. This is the 50-mile emergency planning zone around Palisades. As I mentioned, I'm on the board of Don't Waste Michigan. I represent the Kalamazoo chapter. This is my hometown. These are my stomping grounds. But you'll see that the drinking water supply of Chicago, in fact, the drinking water supply of Milwaukee, is all at risk from Palisades. So what are recommendations on these safety risks? Well, there are at least one remaining capsule, perhaps more, at Palisades that could have been withdrawn a long time ago. These are metal coupons that can be analyzed in a lab to see how bad the embrittlement actually is and to test the optimistic assumptions that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and industry are making about how high these pressurized thermal shock risk levels actually are. Instead, they depend on computer simulations, and it's not good enough. And the other system structures and components I mentioned should be similarly inspected. And when Palisades finally does shut down, a comprehensive autopsy of not only the reactor pressure vessel, but these other systems should be performed, and lessons learned applied at other similar reactors around the country that are equally old. And why it's important to test your hypotheses with actual real-world physical data comes from Japan. Japan's most embrittled reactor pressure vessel was at Genkai. So you'll see the solid line, the dotted line, that is the safety standard for embrittlement. And conveniently, all of the predictions were that the vessel was beneath those safety standards. It was going to be okay. When they actually pulled a physical sample, that's in the upper right, it turns out the actual embrittlement levels were much higher than the predictions. And that could very well be the case at Palisades. In fact, they have rolled back regulations at Palisades on embrittlement and across the country time and time again over the decades. So security risks. This image actually appeared in Esquire magazine, and it revealed a major security breach at Palisades. The head of security at Palisades claimed that was him in a photo. It was not him. He was lying. He was unqualified for his job, but he lied his way in. And what was really concerning was the darkness of his lies. He claimed to be a one-man death squad working for shadowy US federal agencies overseas, none of which was true. He had a very vivid imagination. But it seems that those claims got him the job at Palisades, for which he was incompetent and unqualified. And Esquire was the one who outed him in 2007. And the response from local law enforcement was, he had us all fooled. But it begs the question, what is security like at Palisades now, especially with a really bad history over the decades at Entergy? So a major expose was done by Project on Government Oversight on the first anniversary of the 9/11, showing that security at various Entergy plants was really bad, based on whistleblower testimony. There were major security breaches revealed in the 2016-2015 timeframe at Palisades, having to do with overworked security guards given way too much to do, and then simply filling out forms to say they had done the jobs that they had not done. And one of those jobs was fire watches to make sure there were not fires happening on the plant. And there's another issue I wanted to bring up, which is a Michigan state law that grants immunity across the state, including at Palisades, to security guards killing innocent people, including tourists, people engaging in recreation at the adjacent Van Buren State Park. And I wanted to show this image. This is actually a satellite image of me with a B Geigy radiation monitor at the Palisades, actually at Van Buren State Park. But you can see that along the beach especially, you can walk right up to the fence line of Palisades. There's actually not a fence there. You could walk into the facility to a certain extent. Security would probably come after you pretty quickly, but I wanted to show that how close people can get. And what's unfortunate at Palisades is the signage is deteriorating. This is right at the fence line on the beach. You can see the plant in the background. What's really concerning is there are no signs on the water, and on a summer day, there can be 24 boats anchored immediately offshore. So the security risks would be malicious actors who could get that close and carry out an attack at very short distance. I mentioned the need for a just transition. The workforce needs to be retained as much as possible. They know where the contamination is. They have experience with storing the high-level radioactive waste. Unfortunately, Holtec, if they do get ownership of this site, are infamous for simply letting go a large number of the workforce. And local municipalities need to be compensated. There is a bill in Congress, and I wanted to give a shout out to Representative Schneider from Illinois, as well as Senator Duckworth, for sponsoring for several years now the Stranded Act that would compensate host communities like Zion, Illinois, like Covert, Township, Michigan, for being the unwilling hosts for high-level radioactive waste that has nowhere to go. So we are fully engaged in attempting to stop Holtec's takeover of the Palisades site. And I'll get into more detail, but we're trying to block Holtec's consolidated interim storage facility in New Mexico. We're trying to prevent Holtec from looting Palisades Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund for non-decommissioning expenses. And we're trying to stop them from getting waivers or exemptions from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to simply start to dismantle any planning or even infrastructure having to do with emergency preparedness. There are many risks during the decommissioning phase that could unleash catastrophe. Emergency response is needed. So why would we call for the blocking of consolidated interim storage in New Mexico and Texas? Well, it's a violation of environmental justice. It's a violation of consent-based siting. And if any of these dump sites, including Yucca Mountain, Nevada, were to open, it could launch 450 barges of high-level radioactive waste on Lake Michigan, from Palisades, from Kewanee, Wisconsin, a shutdown reactor, from Point Beach, Wisconsin, still operating. Road and rail shipments are not safe. They are also risky. And this shows you a map of the routes in Michigan. Heavy haul is being proposed to Bangor from Palisades. This is the Big Rock Point reactor pressure vessel in 2003, a heavy haul shipment that had numerous incidents during its shipment. This is a photo of a train shipment of high-level radioactive waste. We do want to block Holtec's proposed looting of the Decommissioning Trust Fund, which is already woefully inadequate, and they want to drain away more than a third of what's there for non-decommissioning related expenses like spent nuclear fuel management, like site restoration. That's the $35 million figure. That means stormwater management. It also means landscaping. These are huge drains on the fund. There is tremendous contamination at Palisades. An entire chapter of my coworker Paul Gunter's report here from 2010, updated in 2015, is about Palisades. There have been tritium leaks into soil, into groundwater, into the facilities themselves. A flood of the radioactive waste building unleashed isotopes like cesium, which is very concerning, onto the site. And hazardous chemicals, toxins like hydrazine have leaked. There's asbestos across the site. And Lake Michigan and the aquifers are drinking water supplies. So as I mentioned, Environmental Coalition, Beyond Nuclear, Don't Waste Michigan, Michigan Safe Energy, Future intervened at Palisades on February 24th against Holtec's takeover. So did Michigan's Attorney General. So did the Environmental Law and Policy Center based in Chicago. So I mentioned the risks that continue during the decommissioning phase, risks of pool fires, dry cask storage risks, risk of releases of radioactivity during dismantlement of facilities, and movement of soil. This is an image showing a pool fire aftermath if it were to occur at a nuclear plant on the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland. You can see a large region of our country would be severely contaminated. $2 trillion in property damage. Many millions of Americans becoming nuclear evacuees. This is an image from Point Beach, incident in late May of 1996 with a ventilated storage cask. The same model is used at Palisades. They had an explosion at Point Beach on that day, and they've had fires at Palisades with these same containers. So there was a cask dangle at Palisades in 2005 that got front page coverage in the Detroit Free Press, which was a huge risk of a pool fire. This is Fukushima Daiichi, emergency unloading of the pool at Unit 4 after the catastrophe began. And a pool fire at Fukushima was narrowly averted, which would have rendered northeastern Japan uninhabitable. Up to 50 million people would have had to have been evacuated. So the recommendations here are to block these Western dumps in Congress, to stop Holtec's takeover of Palisades and Big Rock Point, and to require emergency preparedness going into the future. So record high Lake Michigan water levels. I've come to the end of my time, so I'll just go quickly here. Any contamination left behind at Palisades will flow into Lake Michigan or into inland aquifers if not cleaned up. And Holtec has proposed a very inadequate cleanup of the site. But in addition, there are tremendous risks to the dry cask storage at Palisades. These are ventilated storage casks deployed at only 3 sites in our country: Point Beach, Wisconsin, Palisades, and Arkansas Nuclear One, in competition for the worst dry cask storage model in the country. In fact, that one that stands by itself is likely the 4th to be loaded at Palisades in the summer of 1994. Admittedly defective, the company and the NRC promised that waste would be put back into the storage pool if there were problems with the casks. Here we are more than a quarter century later, and that cask still sits that close to Lake Michigan, fully loaded. These are the dry casks at Big Rock Point. And so whether it is a tsunami from the Great Lakes, whether it is seiches, whether it is severe weather, a storm surge made worse by climate changes, these dry cask storage facilities are vulnerable to disastrous releases. And Both dry cast storage pads at Palisades are in violation of NRC earthquake safety regulations. So our recommendations here would be hardened on-site storage, further inland to higher ground. In fact, Pilgrim, Massachusetts, Holtec even is doing that under popular demand up in Massachusetts, getting it further away from the ocean. And also, all of the radiological contamination of the site needs to be cleaned up, or else it's going to hemorrhage into Lake Michigan over time. And this is an image of hardened or robust on-site storage. That is an earthen berm that would prevent line of sight attacks as by anti-tank missiles fired from a distance. That needs to take place at Palisades. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. So our next speakers are from Wisconsin. Want to introduce our friend and colleagues, Hannah Mortensen and Ann Behrman, MD, who are with Physicians for Social Responsibility based in Madison. So when you're ready, Hannah, take it away. And you're on there.
Hello, everyone. Like David said, my name is Hannah Mortensen, and I am the Executive Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility. And then go ahead, Ann.
Hi, my name is Ann Behrman. Welcome, everyone. I'm a pediatrician in Madison, Wisconsin, and the long-term treasurer of Physicians for Social Responsibility in Madison. Thanks.
So today, our section is about Point Beach Nuclear Power Plant, which is located on the shores of Lake Michigan near Two Rivers, Wisconsin, in the county of Manitowoc. And there are 2 nuclear reactors at Point Beach, units 1 and 2. And those were online in 1970 and 1973. And their license expire in 2030 and 2033, respectively. And so what is happening currently is NextEra Energy has applied for a 20-year license extension past that 2030 and 2033 date. So that would bring, if approved, the expected life of the nuclear reactors to 80 years, when the original expectation was only for 40 years. So that's a little background on Point Beach, as well as the location. So a little bit about one of our big concerns today is water quality. So Point Beach does not have any cooling towers. Point Beach discharges almost 915 million gallons of Lake Michigan water per day. And that water can be up to 24 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than the intake temperature. This is a large thermal load, and it is thermal pollution to Lake Michigan. There was a study done by the Chicago Tribune in 2011 that actually found that Point Beach reduced the yield of Lake Michigan's fisheries by an estimated 10,600 pounds a year. Or you could find it out to be 4.5% of the annual commercial fishing weight. So during the process of the intake of the water, the juvenile fish that fit through the screens are killed, any fish eggs are killed, any larvae are killed through the cleaning process and the heat and pressure. So that's where that 4.5% comes in. And that's a huge economical factor as well as recreational factor to consider. But bringing this all together, there's a bigger impact happening on Lake Michigan. When you already think about the precarious nature of the lake already, considering climate change, considering our increased nutrient pollution on the lake and increased cyanobacteria and toxic algae blooms. To add the thermal pollution on top of that, that makes our lake really worse off. And I think we have to acknowledge that. So, and not to mention, if an accident were to occur, as Kevin had mentioned, I mean, this is Lake Michigan. They supply 10 million people with drinking water. That's everyone around, including Chicago. And that would be a displacement of all those that live on the shoreline as well, if Lake Michigan is affected. And so at the very least, we are asking for cooling towers to be constructed at Point Beach, or if they can't be constructed, the shutdown of the plant, as Lake Michigan is already in a precarious state. So that's just one of our concerns, and I'll let Ann talk about our next.
Hi, everyone. So I want to talk a little bit about what must happen if there is an accident at Point Beach. You've heard already about embrittlement from Kevin's presentation. From a Nuclear Regulatory Commission evaluation in about 2013, Point Beach's Unit 2 was identified as one of 2 or 3 most embrittled reactor vessels for nuclear power plants still operating today. Come next year, its sister plant in Palisades is slated for decommissioning, and Diablo Canyon in somewhere around 2024. But NextEra, the owners of Point Beach nuclear units, is asking for these 2 power plants to be relicensed to operate for a full 80 years until 2050 and 2053. This risk of cracking of the containment vessel in the event of an emergency shutdown is worrisome, particularly since we have only computer modeling and not the real data from capsule testing to have a more scientific means to assess metal fatigue, something that you heard from Kevin already about. Couple this embrittlement risk with the knowledge from both the EPA and NOAA that climate change is increasing storm strength in the Midwest as elsewhere, both increased precipitation and wind strength. And this data should give all of us who live in Wisconsin significant cause for concern. So here on this slide, you can see the 10-mile evacuation zone around the Point Beach nuclear plant. Most of our knowledge of health risks from nuclear reactor accidents is primarily from the disasters at Chernobyl in the Ukraine in 1986, and the meltdown of 3 of 4 reactors at the Fukushima Daiichi plant as a result of the March 11, 2011 tsunami in Japan. And note that Fukushima released only about 1/10 of the radiation that Chernobyl released. So what needs to happen if there would be an accident? Well, first, good communication by trained public health officials to the people living, working, and recreating within the 10-mile exposure zone, and realize that for Point Beach, that includes Point Beach Forest State Park, and also beaches in 2 rivers. People that are in this 10-mile zone would need to be told whether to shelter in place or to evacuate the area. The exposed population also would need quick access to potassium iodide, ideally within 4 hours of exposure, to reduce their risk of developing thyroid cancer. Potassium iodide orally is really most important for pregnant women, infants, and children. We know that the 2 hospitals, Holy Family Memorial and Aurora Bay Medical Center, that would be responsible for care of injured victims have staff that attend special trainings, but community first responders, that is police, emergency medical technicians, our paramedics, and firefighters also need training to care for contaminated workers and those exposed in the 10-mile radius. Also, farmers and those living in the 50-mile ingestion zone, which is a second big zone that encompasses Appleton and Green Bay, will need accurate information about crops and livestock that likely would be affected by excess radiation release. But how much farmland, dairies, and animal grazing would be lost if there was an accident at Point Beach? Well, we can only assume from Fukushima, and that's why I have this slide up, what happened there. There was a 20-kilometer, about 12.5 square mile evacuation zone that includes an area of 230 square miles. That was evacuated. Ultimately, nearly 165,000 people left their home, and 10 years later, more than 37,000 still have not returned. And note, even beyond that 20-kilometer evacuation radius, the cloud of radiation affected other principalities in Japan as well. And those are not places where people can grow crops or have dairies. Although the news about nuclear disaster points to few deaths after an accident, in reality, we need to look at the bigger picture of what effect a disaster has on population mortality. Just as we've learned with the COVID pandemic, medical epidemiologists now recognize that there have been significant numbers of people who died as a result of the pandemic, not of COVID itself, but of untreated or late treatment of heart attacks and cancers. We're just beginning to realize that population displacement after an accident, ostensibly done to safeguard health, comes with risks for excess mortality or death, both elevated mental health stress and significant disruptions of the chronic care system for all kinds of health problems such as diabetes, heart disease, etc. And we also need to think about, would radioactive waste make Lake Michigan unswimmable or the fish inedible, meaning the end of tourism in Door County and for sure at Point Beach State Forest. Now I'm going to turn it over to Hannah to talk a little bit more about climate change and risks.
So I'm actually going to be sharing a little bit of an anecdote, a little personal story. I'm actually originally from Eastern Iowa. And so the Duane Arnold nuclear energy plant is an example I'm going to be sharing real quickly here. On August 10th, 2020, a derecho, which is an extreme high wind event, swept across Iowa. This derecho impacted Duane Arnold, and it was 10 miles away from Cedar Rapids, which has a population of 130,000 people. And it was 30 miles from my parents' home, where they currently live and were living at the time, and where I spent my entire childhood at. So this really hits home to me that the true risk, and I do not want any of this risk to happen in my new state of Wisconsin. So the derecho caused significant damage to Duane Arnold. It, one, cut off external power supply. It blew down the cooling towers. And it took plant operators 14 hours of maneuvering to stabilize and cool down the reactor. This was a near meltdown. This was a near disaster. And Duane Arnold was actually issued to decommission right away following these damages, rather than its planned date set in October. So I was there one day after derecho. There's actually a picture of me and my dad assisting with the volunteer efforts. And Cedar Rapids was devastated. The roads were completely inaccessible. Power lines were down. People didn't have, cell towers were down. Internet was only available if your phone was still charged. There wasn't even food to go around at the supermarkets. So imagining how 130,000 people in Cedar Rapids could have evacuated in this situation that Duane Arnold, it escalated and became a point where we needed to evacuate, it wasn't going to happen. People would have been stuck there. And for me, it really hits home and really is what like I said, a true nightmare. And I think we need to acknowledge that we didn't think derechos would happen. We didn't think damage at Duane Arnold could happen, but it did. And it did just this last August. And to think about that an accident could occur here in Point Beach in Wisconsin and then affect Lake Michigan, it's a nightmare that I don't ever want to see. And so that's why I'm so passionate about this issue. And one last note about Duane Arnold is it's actually a prime example of how we can replace nuclear energy with solar. NextEra has actually planned to build a solar farm around Duane Arnold. And this is super exciting for the community, for the renewable energy sector. The energy produced there will actually be more than what Duane Arnold produced before. And they're also instituting new battery systems. And they're trying to do this by 2023. So this shows that it can be done quickly. And this could be done by the time in Point Beach, when the license actually expire in 2030 and 2033. We have years to do this to supplement our energy supply. And so that's why Duane Arnold is such a good example of how we can replace that energy.
So we want to end with some data on economic costs to We Energy customers. Now, as a result of the 2007 power purchase agreement between NextEra, which was then Florida Power and Light, the current owners of Point Beach, and We Energies, which was then WEPCO, who sold Point Beach to NextEra. In 2007, the negotiated price of electricity was probably reasonable, given that this was just before the fracking boom in the US. We were still buying oil from foreign sources, and much of our electricity in Wisconsin came from coal and gas plants. But this is not the case now. PSR Wisconsin is a formal intervener opposing the 20-year relicensing permit for Point Beach nuclear power, engaged Dr. Mark Cooper, who is now a senior fellow for economic analysis at the Institute for Energy and the Environment at the Vermont Law School, and also the director of research at the Consumer Federation of America. And we asked Mark to look more closely at the economic and efficiency issues of electricity production from the operation of Point Beach, both currently now, or until the plant current license ends in 2030, and in the future. His current assessment for We Energy's customers at Point Beach is that one, cumulative excess costs, that is ending in 2030, we're not talking about the 20-year more of operation, for operation of Point Beach would be, would cost consumers to We Energy about $5 billion in the time period between 2021 and 2030. That means already about $3,000 in extra energy costs for every We Energy's customer by 2030, or for families, about $300 for each family per year. Next slide, please. So here's a graph to give you some background on the changes in price of electricity from 2009 to 2019. Note that the solar, this is the red line, solar costs have declined about 89% in the last 10 years, and onshore wind by about 70% in the same time frame. Meanwhile, costs for electricity from nuclear plants has increased by 26%. And also note that on April 1st, Alliant Energy, another of Wisconsin's public utilities, announced construction of more than 1,000 megawatts of solar capacity by 2030, an amount that would be close to the megawatt output now of Point Beach nuclear plants. So to conclude, what's the risk now with Point Beach units 1 and 2? Next slide. Okay, 30 more years of thermal load, which we now have allowed to continue for more than 50 years. We realize that the old adage, dilution is the solution to pollution, is a myth, and we need to either demand that NextEra construct cooling towers or cease operations at Point Beach. And all of us will be, therefore, the true protectors of Lake Michigan's fragile aquatic ecosystem. We ask our congressional representatives and senators to do better for Wisconsin energy consumers and work with the Wisconsin PSC to void or to change the current power purchase agreement or PPA and stop gouging hardworking farmers, families, and local industrial customers while enriching NextEra and their shareholders. We know that before the current Point Beach nuclear plant licenses end in 2030 and 2033, Wisconsin utilities have the ability and the interest to replace this aging nuclear plant with cheaper, safer, and cleaner renewables. And finally, we currently have spent fuel stored at both Point Beach and now at the closed Kewanee Power Station just 12 miles north of Point Beach, both on the shores of Lake Michigan. Do we really want to leave an additional 1,000 metric tons of nuclear waste after 2030 for the many, many generations of Wisconsinites in the future to deal with?
And there's also the risk when it comes to the worst case scenario, kind of what Kevin had mentioned earlier about waste being transported by barges on Lake Michigan, as well as trucks on land and trains. What has been termed a mobile Chernobyl. And this is a picture on the left of a recent accident containing uranium hexafluoride in North Carolina. And there's some articles out there about what happened there. There's also the risk of accidents from embrittlement. And that leads to consequences for homes, farmlands, crops, our economy, and our communities. There's the loss of drinking water for over 10 million people, and the loss of Lake Michigan as a place to swim, recreate, and to fish. These are the worst case scenarios that we do not want to happen. So our big asks today from congressional representatives as well as our senators is to protect Lake Michigan and to protect the people of Wisconsin. Wisconsin should mandate the construction of the cooling towers at Point Beach or shut down the plant, either or. Demand that the NRC provide new opportunities for meaningful public engagement throughout this entire process, as well as further transparency from the NRC in monitoring procedures, the sampling done around the shoreline around Point Beach, and more information about the relicensing and decommissioning processes, as it is not easy for a layperson to understand this entire process. So those are our big asks today, and that's all that we have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hannah and Ann. And again, we invite people to put questions in the chat box if you have any. We'll be glad to answer them as we go along. I'm also glad that Hannah and Ann finished referencing the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, which is going to be the next topic that we're going to discuss today. My friend and colleague Mike Keegan from Michigan and I will take care of that. And I just would like to frame the discussion to begin with by pointing something out. NEIS has been at this for 40 years, and somewhere in the 1990s, Senator Pete Domenici from New Mexico, who was a pro-nuclear advocate, took aside the then chairperson of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Shirley Jackson, and warned her that if she didn't back off on her assertive style of regulation and following the regulations as they were written, Senator Domenici would be pulling significant portions out of the NRC budget. Since that time, all of us on this call and many other activists around the country have found that the NRC has devolved into a fairly worthless regulator. to the point where the NRC really stands for not really concerned. We'll get into that a little bit more detail. So I'm going to turn it over now to Mike Keegan, who will be sharing some of his experiences on this. Mike, go ahead.
Thank you, David. I'm Michael Keegan from Monroe, Michigan. I'm a social scientist, and I've been tracking nuclear power for 40 years. One of the first things I learned as a social scientist was about bureaucracies. And the first rule of order we learned from bureaucracies is they self-perpetuate. And what that has led to is a regulatory agency which no longer regulates. They have been captured by the industry. And it was every regulator gets at some point gets captured by the industry, but it's a matter of degree. With the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and nuclear power, there are 6 different categories by which they hide documents from the public. First, they declare the proprietary information, trade secret, you can't see it. Then there's security issues. Then there's potentially sensitive material. There are 3 other categories by which the documents you actually would want to see to be able to make a judgment and analysis is kept hidden. And oftentimes, documents are sent through a spin cycle by which they are not made public for months. And in several cases, we just found a document that we needed that was 40 years, been in the queue for 40 years, not submitted. So what we have is a regulatory agency which does not regulate. And unfortunately, the public stands down. Politicians stand down because this is their job. They're the regulator. But it's been kept secret. Last week, I reviewed a document that's called a SECI report. It's a high-level analysis that's going to the NRC Commission to become policy. In that SECI report, they are proposing changing the inspection from 120 months to 240 months. We're going to defer inspections. We're going to defer work on many, many systems. It's just obscene. These plants are jalopies. They are running them into the ground. These corporations are limited liability corporations, and they really have no skin in the game. The NRC has been rubber stamping exemption upon exemption and allowing the industry to essentially do as they will. Recently, in this past year, we have had a major pandemic, an epidemic, a national crisis. During that time, beginning in March, the NRC started handing out exemptions, COVID exemptions. Utilities requesting, we want to be able to defer work because to be able to do the work now would be a hardship on the work crew, and therefore we want to kick it down the road to the next refueling. What this has resulted in is deregulation of emergency evacuation plans, of emergency planning, of insurance, of a number of inspections, and just a whole lot of categories. The nuclear regulatory is not doing their job. Now, unfortunately, it falls on the public to be the regulator here and to hold their feet to their fire and go through these obscure documents to find the kernel of information you need to secure nuclear engineers, which we do, to do the analysis. But it's always hide the ball, hide the pea under the shell. So we're constantly looking for that needle in the haystack to be able to confront them. Now we're always saying, well, you can always go through the freedom of information. Well, freedom of information goes through a long spin cycle, and they don't come back with the information that you need in a timely way. By the time you do see it, it's a moot point. Everything's moved on down the road. We have to appeal to the Atomic Safety Licensing Board with contentions on these licensing, the license transfer at Palisades and the license extension at Point Beach. We have to appeal to the Atomic Safety Licensing Board, and we have to put all our evidence of our contention up front. And it's virtually an impossible task to do because they are hiding the documents from the public. So we're left in a quandary where we really are dependent on Congress and the Senate to have an active role in oversight and to hold hearings at a regular, at least a couple times a year, just a baseline, and then on specific items as they come up. An example of this deregulation, this dereliction of regulation, I am from Monroe, Michigan, and we have the Fermi nuclear power plant. We discovered that for 29 years, there was debris in the torus. The torus is a cooling system that stores the water that to be cooled. It has to be pumped out. Well, all the coating on the torus was sloughing off and contaminating, clogging up the filtration valves, filters, and not allowing the pumps to pump. 29 years this went on, and each time it came up, it got deferred. Finally, we were able to generate enough confrontation on this that they forced the utility to actually do the work. And it was much worse than they acknowledged. But it's that kind of deferment. At Palisades this past September, they deferred inspections, they deferred proper repair on welds that were faulty. They put out a patch that was scheduled to last 21.7 months. It's engineered good for 21.7 months. Won't be an issue because we're only going to run 20 more months. The standard repair would have been a much more extensive repair. It would have been certified for 27 years. But because they're at the end of their life cycle, they're saying, well, this is just good enough. And the NRC rubber stamped it. At Cook, a very similar thing happened in October. 2/3 of the penetration wells were exposed during the refueling. They took the lid off, and they found of the 2/3 that they could inspect, 1/2 of them were faulty and had cracks and corrosion and crud. And they refused to look at the other 1/3 of the penetration wells because it would have been an economic hardship to have taken off the insulation to actually inspect it. And besides, it wasn't on our schedule. It would delay us, an economic hardship. These nuclear power plants make about $1 million net a day, a large facility. But they're always perpetually arguing hardship, economic hardship if we had to do the repair proper. So let's just defer it for 2 more years. And that is the philosophy that underpins the NRC. So we really don't have a regulator. We have an enabler who is aiding and abetting. Anytime the utility comes forward and makes a request, the NRC aids and abets what is criminal negligence. Now, over the years, I've driven jalopies because you do. But I also do the repairs on them. And it comes a point where you're at diminishing returns. And they are at the point of diminishing returns. They don't want to do the repairs. So please, to the senators and to Congress, please take an active role in oversight. That is missing. And the onus always falls on the public to scream and holler, try to catch them with limited information. And we're perpetually given the mushroom treatment, kept in the dark, and every now and then they open the door and throw some crap at us. So that's my presentation, and they're looting the funds. The NRC is aiding and abetting criminal behavior. So there really needs to be some oversight. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to take a few minutes to finish up this section, and then we're going to open it up to discussion and any questions that you in the audience, and particularly the congressional staffers, may have. So to follow up on this NRC issue, I am putting together a paper which we'll be sending to you along with the other printed documents that we have for this briefing, probably by the end of the week or early next week. So far, it's a 6-page paper of bullet points, because we know that you congressional staffers love bullet points. You hate all this long talk. So we're putting it in bullet point form. And these 6 pages are just recent examples of the NRC failing its obligation to protect the health and the environment in 4 main areas. The first is the way that the NRC actively thwarts the public process and public participation. The second area is example after example of the NRC making technical decisions that are arbitrary and capricious, but always in favor of the nuclear industry and what they request. The third area we will point out is that the NRC operates in a mode where there's a lack of transparency and at times outright deception of both the public and perhaps of Congress. And then finally, to touch on a theme that Michael mentioned, the very erratic and questionable response that the NRC has shown in terms of dealing with nuclear reactors during the COVID-19 pandemic. So these are the four main areas, and I've already got dozens of bullet points, which I won't share here for interest of time. But what I want to conclude with are a set of two quotations. The first comes from the Diet report, the independent commission that was commissioned by the Japanese Diet in 2012 to get at the root causes of the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And I want to read some quotes from this because I think it applies to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The first one is, the regulators did not monitor or supervise nuclear safety. The lack of expertise resulted in, quote, regulatory capture, unquote. And by the way, that's a phrase we have heard from some of your predecessors in congressional staff circles, where they have referred to the NRC as under regulatory capture. Resulted in regulatory capture and the postponement of the implementation of relevant regulations, which is exactly what Michael's been talking about. They avoided their direct responsibilities by letting operators apply regulations on a voluntary basis. Without the investigation of this commission operating independently of government, many of the facts revealing the collusion between the regulators and other players may never have been revealed. Now, to push this a little further on the regulatory capture front, the Commission's examination of the way safety regulations are deliberated and amended reveals a cozy relationship between the operators, the regulators, and academic scholars that can only be described as totally inappropriate. Further down, they say, they repeatedly avoided, compromised, or postponed any course of action and any regulation or finding that threatened the continued operation of nuclear reactors. The FEPC, which was in essence, the trade group for the Japanese nuclear industry, has been the main organization through which this intransigent position was maintained among the regulatory agencies and in the academic world. And to conclude from the Japanese report, the Commission found that the actual relationship lacked independence and transparency and was far from being a safety culture. In fact, it was a typical example of regulatory capture in which the oversight of the industry by regulators effectively ceases. And this has been a point that we have been making for decades, that we have been visiting staffers in Washington, D.C. on these issues. I will conclude with one other quote from Dr. Gregory Yatsko, who is the former chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I saw things up close that I was not meant to see. An agency overwhelmed by the industry it was supposed to regulate, and a political system determined to keep it that way. When I started at NRC, I gave no thought to the question of whether nuclear power could be controlled. By the end, I no longer had that luxury. I know nuclear power is a failed technology. So we bring these issues before you staffers to take to your bosses, saying, you folks are the only last gasp bastion we have of protecting Lake Michigan from the problems at Point Beach and at Palisades, and even the remaining ones here in Illinois, which is the most nuclear reliant state in the country. If Congress doesn't step forward and exert that kind of control over the NRC, we have the same rubber stamp situation that the Japanese claim was the root cause for the disaster in Fukushima. And we certainly would hope that those of you who are representing congressional offices wouldn't want to turn your states into the Belarus of the Midwest. So I will stop there, and we will now open it up to any comments or questions you have. I'm going to check the chat box. A reminder, we have recorded this, and we will make it available, and we will make the chat available as well. So if you have questions or if you want clarifications, this will be the time to put it in chat. We'll get to them. So looking this over, there's a question. Mike Keegan, could you give evidence to support your statement that within 5 years, the lake will eat the plants?
I was in Chicago at the time, so I can't categorically deny it. But there are weather events that are occurring, and these plants are not hardened. Tornado missiles can result. So these are what the industry likes to call black swans, 1 in a 10 billion type of event. Well, you don't need a tsunami or an earthquake to lose power to a nuclear power plant and start a station blackout, which leads you into a situation where you're in peril. At Fermi in 1988, a raccoon fried itself and took out the electrical bus, which shut down the Fermi plant. Just this past summer, mayflies, it was June, but fish flies, mayflies, the swarm was so great that they arced the electrical switch yard at Fermi, shut the plant down, emergency shutdown. And Mother Nature bats last.
Okay, thanks, Michael.
Hello, I'm
So are
calling
we.
in from New Mexico, and we're dealing with the threat of the holding all the waste here and at the temporary site. And so I'm just wondering when all these power plants shut down, especially Illinois being the most nuclear reliant state, what do the community, what do the special interest groups and stakeholders want to see happen to that waste? I'm concerned because that's what we're dealing with here in New Mexico. We don't have a nuclear power plant, but we have many nuclear facilities, and our state feels like our hands are tied because the federal government is, pushing forward the application for CIS, whereas our state doesn't really have an authority on it. And so we're looking to our friends in places like Illinois and around these power plants to help us out with that. Thanks.
Okay, maybe we could take this state by state. If any of you know what kind of response your populations in Wisconsin, Michigan, and I'll take Illinois are having towards this issue of what do we do with the waste? Michigan, want to go first?
Sure. So both Michael Keegan and I, Michael is co-chair of the board of directors of Don't Waste Michigan, and I'm a board member. And I'm very proud to share with everyone that Don't Waste Michigan, along with 6 other grassroots groups, as well as Beyond Nuclear, have all intervened against the consolidated interim storage facilities targeting New Mexico and Texas. I mentioned it briefly in my slideshow. NEIS is another intervener in that legal intervention that had been an NRC licensing proceeding. But on the Holtec, New Mexico case, that is pretty much done at the NRC. And so we have moved into the second highest court in the land, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. So long story short, we are fighting consolidated interim storage with everything we have, as we have done for more than a quarter century, because there have been previous proposals. Skull Valley Indian Reservation in Utah, for example, for a consolidated interim storage, but also the permanent disposal at Yucca Mountain, Nevada, which is Western Shoshone Indian land. So that's the position we've taken for a very long time, and we've had to do battle with our neighbors, with our state elected officials, with state agencies, with members of Congress like Fred Upton, who have the position of get it out of here. We don't care how it gets there. We don't care where it goes. That's their position. It's an unethical position. It's an immoral position. In the case of consolidated interim storage, it's an illegal position because the Nuclear Waste Policy Act forbids the Department of Energy from taking ownership to commercial spent nuclear fuel unless there is a repository open, and there is not. So I'll just close by saying how thankful and happy I am that the state of New Mexico Attorney General filed a lawsuit against the Nuclear Regulatory Commission just last week for its illegal behavior that our groups have been calling to the NRC's attention since at least October of 2016 on these current proposals, that their licensing proceeding itself is illegal. They should not even be considering these license applications. not to mention the environmental justice violations and the violation of consent-based siting.
Hannah, did you want to respond in the case of Wisconsin?
Or I'll respond to Wisconsin.
Ann?
I was going to just say that I don't think there's any official policy from the state of Wisconsin about it, but I mean, I think PSR Wisconsin has been a big fan of not the NIMBYs. You know, that if you benefit from the energy being produced and used in your state, you ought to be able to deal with the waste. And I don't think any of us want to see the waste go on barges on Lake Michigan or on the roadways. So I think that a better idea than interim storage or shipping it out west needs to happen. I think that's what, I just speak, and Hannah, you and Alfred can speak to this, but I think PSR would speak to that it, needs to be safely stored. And, the Kewanee plant that's 12 miles north of Point Beach is in safe store. So all their storage is in dry cask storage now, still on Lake Michigan, and still has its problems, as Kevin said, but isn't going anywhere real soon, I don't think.
I'll take Illinois' situation. For years, maybe decades even, we have resisted the notion of get it off the lake as fast as you can at Zion, which is in the 10th district, the northeast corner of Illinois, bordering southern Wisconsin. Back in the day when Mark Kirk was still a state representative, and even his predecessor, John Porter, we had to argue with them saying, you don't move something somewhere unless you have a place to put it. And that is the argument that often gets ignored, not just by politicians or the media, but by the public in its interest to just get it out thoughtlessly. So we've been fighting this for over 20 years, that unless there is a permanent final disposal facility somewhere, which hasn't been identified yet, the waste needs to stay where it is responsibly. And Kevin gave a very good presentation on what that means in terms of hardened on-site storage for the waste. This is a responsible environmental way of managing the waste until the human race gets a lot smarter on how to dispose of it, which we aren't yet. Now, the one issue that also does not get brought up enough, and we've even had problems with this dealing with our environmental colleagues in Illinois, is the notion of the extent to which nuclear power, well, not just has become, but is an environmental justice issue. And the waste is a perfect example of that. The idea that communities east of the Mississippi River and metropolitan areas can enjoy the benefits of nuclear power while dumping on indigenous lands or people of color communities in the far west in sparser populated areas is irresponsible and unjust to begin with, but it is clearly a violation of the Himej principles, which is supposed to be guiding the environmental justice movement and the environmental justice community. We have pointed this out to Senator Tammy Duckworth because she was one of the co-founders of the Senate's Environmental Justice Caucus. And we will continue making this point amongst the Illinois delegation that if you advocate for moving the waste to the proposed communities in Texas and New Mexico, you are in violation of environmental justice principles. And you cannot claim the moral high ground that you have previously done. So it's an uphill struggle. People intuitively, counterintuitively want to get rid of it fast. And we understand that. I want to get rid of a toothache fast too, but the responsible thing to do is go to a dentist, not just yank it out. So it's a situation of don't just do something, stand there and re-examine it. Groups on this call and elsewhere around the country for over 20 years now have been articulating a plan for management of radioactive waste, which Congress has ignored. And it's time that this message goes back through the staffers to the principals, saying we have to have a new radioactive waste policy.
And I would add, what's needed is full cost accounting. Every day that the plants operate, they're generating, the product is nuclear waste. The product is poison. The energy is fleeting, it's gone, it's mostly wasted in transmission. This is a cash cow that utilities exploit. Stop making the problem. Limit the size of the waste and then deal with it at hardened on-site storage. Do the full cost accounting. It's just digging a deeper and deeper hole in debt. And the utilities never, and the NRC never want to bring into the equation the cost to health, the environment, so on and so forth. Do the accounting, and the plants will shut themselves down.
So I think we have one more comment, and then we will wrap up. Alfred, you wanted to add something? Alfred Meyer from PSR?
I was just going to confirm that in Wisconsin, we believe that the waste should be stored on site, but in hardened, safe ways. And the problem, one of the many problems with consolidated interim storage is that assuming that it in fact would be only interim, it means that there are twice as many shipments of nuclear waste because you have to ship it once from where it is to where it's interim stored, and then a second time from interim to permanent storage. So I just want to confirm what other people have said on the call.
Thanks, Alfred. All right, I want to thank Kevin Camps, Hannah Mortensen, Ann Behrman, and Mike Keegan for presenting today. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We hope you got something beneficial out of this. Feel free to keep in touch with us. And for those of you who are staffers for Congress, take this information back to your bosses, please. And we'll have a full information packet available by early next week. So thank you for coming today. Enjoy the rest of the day and stay well.